The cantina was packed with the usual riff-raff. Drifters, bounty hunters, mercenaries, and smugglers huddled over dimly lit tables, their voices a murmur beneath the low hum of ancient machinery. The flickering neon sign outside was half broken, casting a faint, sickly glow through the dust-streaked windows. The bartender, an old man with silver in his hair and lines etched deep into his face, stood behind the bar, silently wiping glasses. He'd seen it all, the violence, the bribes, the fleeting allegiances. None of it fazed him anymore. The doors slid open with a hiss, and the air in the room shifted. Eyes flickered toward the entrance, then quickly away. No one wanted to draw attention to themselves when he walked in. The Galactic crime lord was an imposing figure, wrapped in sleek, dark armor that gleamed in the cantina's dim light. He strode in like he owned the place, flanked by 2 heavily armed enforcers. The tension in the room thickened, but the bartender didn't so much as glance up. The crime lord scanned the room, his eyes filled with the kind of arrogance that came from knowing you were untouchable. He strutted toward the bar, a smirk playing on his lips. "Old man," he called out, his voice carrying over the dull chatter. "Give me your finest." The bartender moved without a word, grabbing a glass from the shelf behind him. His hands were steady, his movements practiced. He set the drink down in front of the crime lord without meeting his gaze. The crime lord chuckled, picking up the glass. "That's it. No bowing? No scraping? You don't know who I am, do you?" Still, the bartender said nothing. One of the enforcers grinned, leaning forward. "You should show some respect, old man. You're standing in front of the most powerful man in this quadrant." The bartender's eyes remained fixed on the glass he was wiping. "I know exactly who he is," he said quietly, his voice barely louder than a whisper. The crime lord paused mid-drink, lowering the glass slowly. "Oh? And you think that matters?" The bartender shrugged. "Not really." The crime lord's grin faltered, replaced with a sneer. He slammed the glass back onto the bar, spilling half of its contents. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But guts only get you so far in this galaxy." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a cold, threatening whisper. "People like you don't last long. You should be grateful I'm not in the mood to make an example out of you." The bartender finally looked up, meeting the crime lord's gaze for the first time. His eyes, dark and steady, betrayed no fear. "You should finish your drink and leave. This place isn't safe for people like you." The room went silent. The patrons shifted uncomfortably in their seats, casting wary glances at the bar. The enforcers exchanged looks, unsure whether to laugh or draw their blasters. The crime lord, however, threw his head back and laughed. "Not safe for people like me? You really don't get it, do you?" He gestured around the room. "I own this place. I own everyone in it. You think you're different? Just because you've survived this long doesn't mean you're untouchable, old man." The bartender's gaze never wavered. He stood still, hands resting calmly on the bar. "You don't own me." The crime lord's face twisted into a scowl. "Maybe I should teach you a lesson." He motioned to one of his enforcers, who stepped forward, hand drifting toward his blaster. Before the enforcer could draw, the bartender spoke again, his voice still calm. "If you're going to pull that, you'd better make it count." The enforcer froze, his hand hovering over his weapon, suddenly unsure. The crime lord narrowed his eyes. "You think you're some kind of tough guy? You think you can take us all on?" The bartender's expression remained unchanged. "No, I just think you should be careful who you threaten." The crime lord scoffed, stepping closer, his face inches from the bartender's. "And why's that?" The bartender's voice dropped to a cold, flat tone. "Because you have no idea who I am." The crime lord hesitated for a split second, a flicker of doubt crossing his features. Then he straightened, brushing off the unease with a sneer. "Doesn't matter who you are. You're a nobody. An old man in a backwater cantina, pretending to be something you're not." The bartender leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. "I've been a lot of things. But a nobody was never one of them." For a moment, the crime lord said nothing, his eyes locked with the bartender's. Then, with a disgusted grunt, he stepped back, waving off his enforcers. "Not worth it," he muttered. "This dump isn't worth the effort." He turned and walked away, his enforcers trailing behind him, though they couldn't hide the uncertainty in their steps. The patrons slowly resumed their conversations, the tension in the air gradually dissipating. But the bartender stayed still, his eyes following the crime lord as he exited the cantina. When the door hissed shut, the bartender returned to wiping the glass, his hands steady as ever. He didn't need to look up to know that his time was coming. Soon, the crime lord would realize just how dangerous it was to mock someone like him. Because the bartender was no ordinary man. He was a shadow, a legend, a weapon once feared across the galaxy. And the man who had destroyed his family had just walked into his bar, unaware that the trap had already been set. The bartender was no stranger to patience. For years, he had watched and waited, quietly gathering every bit of information he could from the shadows of his own bar. The people who walked in had no idea that their every move, every word, was carefully catalogued by the quiet man behind the counter. They were careless, speaking freely, confident in their safety among criminals and mercenaries who had long abandoned the need for discretion. But that was their mistake. He had been biding his time, observing the crime lord's operations through the drunken boasts of his men and the hushed conversations of those trying to broker deals with him. The crime lord's empire was vast, stretching across multiple systems, but it had weaknesses, small cracks that had gone unnoticed by those too arrogant to look. The bartender had no intention of striking quickly. This wasn't about a rash act of vengeance. He had learned to play the long game, and in this, timing was everything. The galaxy may have forgotten who he was, but that was precisely what made him so dangerous now. His opportunity came in pieces, small snippets of conversation he overheard from the regulars. One night, two smugglers sat at a table in the corner, murmuring about a shipment that had gone missing. They spoke in hushed tones, trying to keep their voices low, but the bartender, experienced in the art of eavesdropping, caught every word. Another night, a lieutenant from the crime lord's inner circle got too drunk and rambled about security changes at one of the crime lord's hideouts. The bartender listened, never betraying his interest, knowing that each piece was another step toward his goal. He wasn't in a rush. The crime lord's arrogance blinded him to the growing danger, and the bartender knew that the more overconfident the man became, the easier it would be to dismantle him. The first trap was subtle, almost unnoticeable. A shipment of illegal goods meant for the crime lord's operation disappeared without a trace. The bartender wasn't directly involved. He didn't need to be. He had made connections over the years, quiet favors traded in the dark corners of the galaxy. One of those contacts owed him, and the shipment simply never arrived at its destination. The crime lord's underlings scrambled to explain the loss, but no one could trace it back to the old man at the bar. Next came the rumors. Whispers started to circulate among the lower ranks of the crime lord's empire. Men who had been loyal for years began to question their orders, wondering if their boss was losing control. It was all part of the bartender's plan: create doubt, sow discord, and let the crime lord's empire begin to fracture from within. As the weeks passed, the bartender continued his quiet sabotage. He never struck directly, that wasn't his style. Instead, he allowed the crime lord to slowly unravel, piece by piece. Paranoia began to creep in. The once invincible leader was now questioning everything and everyone around him. His inner circle, once unwavering in their loyalty, started to feel the strain of their leader's growing distrust. The bartender watched as the crime lord grew more erratic, ordering brutal crackdowns on anyone he suspected of betrayal. But the more he tightened his grip, the more the situation slipped through his fingers. The bartender smiled to himself, knowing that the real blow had yet to fall. He waited until the crime lord was at his most vulnerable, his paranoia reaching a fever pitch. The bartender knew from his sources that a crucial meeting was taking place, a deal that would solidify the crime lord's control over a key territory. If this deal succeeded, the crime lord would regain the power he had lost and consolidate his empire. It was the perfect moment for the final trap. Through the same network of contacts, the bartender arranged for a series of subtle disruptions. Communications would fail, key personnel would be delayed, and vital information would be withheld. It would all seem like a series of unfortunate coincidences, but each one was carefully orchestrated to ensure the deal would fall apart. And it did. The crime lord, already on edge, exploded in a fit of rage when the negotiations crumbled. He lashed out at his lieutenants, blaming them for the failures. But the damage had been done. The other party, wary of the crime lord's instability, backed out of the deal, leaving him weaker than ever. By now, the crime lord was starting to suspect that someone was working against him. But he couldn't figure out who. His empire was vast, and he had enemies everywhere. But the bartender remained invisible, a ghost among the regular patrons, never drawing attention to himself. The bartender's plan was nearly complete. He had weakened the crime lord's hold on his empire and set the stage for the final move. All that was left was to deliver the killing blow. But it wouldn't be in the form of an assassination attempt, or a grand gesture. No, it would be subtle, just like everything else he had done. The bartender had long known that the crime lord's greatest weakness wasn't his enemies, it was his own arrogance. The man believed he was untouchable, that no one in the galaxy could ever bring him down. And that belief would be his undoing. As the crime lord's paranoia grew, the bartender knew the time was right. The final trap was set. The cantina doors slid open once more, and the galactic crime lord stormed in, his composure cracking under the weight of his unraveling empire. His once confident stride was now hurried, driven by fear more than arrogance. His eyes darted around the room, searching for threats that weren't there, and his hand never strayed far from the blaster at his side. The patrons sensed the change in him, the shift from powerful leader to a man teetering on the edge of panic. The bartender, as always, stood behind the counter, quietly polishing the same glass, as if the chaos of the galaxy had never touched him. He glanced up briefly as the crime lord approached but said nothing. His face remained a mask of indifference, but inside, he knew that everything was proceeding exactly as he had planned. The crime lord slammed his hand on the bar, drawing the attention of the entire room. "You," he growled, his voice laced with frustration. "You know something. I can feel it." The bartender didn't react, merely setting the glass down and meeting the crime lord's gaze. "I don't know what you mean," he replied, his tone calm and measured, as if they were discussing the weather. The crime lord leaned in closer, his face inches from the bartender's. His breath reeked of desperation. "Don't play games with me. Everything's falling apart. My men, my deals, my operations, nothing's working the way it should. And I know someone's behind it. I know someone's been feeding information. And somehow, it all leads back to this place." The bartender's expression remained unreadable. "A lot of people pass through here. Maybe it's just bad luck." The crime lord's eyes narrowed, his patience wearing thin. "You think I'm an idiot? You think I don't see what's happening? Someone's been pulling strings, setting me up, and you've been here for all of it." His hand rested on the hilt of his blaster. "I want to know who you've been talking to." The tension in the room was palpable. The other patrons, most of them criminals themselves, knew better than to intervene. They watched in silence, waiting to see how this confrontation would play out. The bartender finally set down the cloth he had been using to clean the glass, his movements slow and deliberate. He met the crime lord's glare without flinching. "I've been talking to the same people I always talk to. Anyone who walks through those doors." The crime lord's lip curled in a snarl. "You think I'm going to believe that? You think I don't know what's going on here? I've heard the stories about you. People whisper your name in places you wouldn't expect. They say you're more than you seem." The bartender said nothing, his gaze steady. The crime lord's sneer deepened. "You've been hiding something, haven't you? You've been sitting here, pretending to be just some washed-up old man, but you're not, are you? I've heard the rumors. I've heard about the assassin who disappeared years ago, about how he vanished without a trace. And now here you are, in the middle of nowhere, playing bartender." The words hung in the air, and for the first time, a flicker of something passed across the bartender's face, just for a moment. It was gone as quickly as it had appeared, but the crime lord had seen it, He knew he was close to the truth. "That's it, isn't it?" the crime lord pressed, his voice rising. "You're him, aren't you? The assassin everyone thought was dead. You've been lying low all this time, waiting for the right moment to strike. But why me? Why now?" The bartender remained silent, but his eyes were colder now, harder. The crime lord's hand tightened on his blaster. "Tell me why," he demanded. The bartender's voice, when he finally spoke, was as calm and controlled as ever. "You destroyed my family?" The room seemed to freeze. The crime lord blinked, caught off guard by the quiet statement. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice lower now, less certain. "You don't even remember, do you?" the bartender continued, his tone almost casual. "Years ago, you ordered a hit on a small colony, just because they wouldn't pay your tribute. You had them wiped out, every man, woman, and child. They were no threat to you. They just refused to bend the knee, and you couldn't tolerate that." The crime lord's face hardened. "I've had a lot of people killed. It's part of the business." The bartender nodded slowly. "I know. And you thought you'd never face the consequences. That you were untouchable." His gaze bore into the crime lord's. "But not today." The crime lord's hand moved toward his blaster, but he was too slow. In a blur of motion, the bartender's arm shot out, disarming him with a practiced efficiency that spoke of years of deadly experience. The blaster clattered to the floor, and the crime lord stumbled back, his eyes wide with shock. The bartender didn't pursue him. He stood there, calm as ever, watching the man who had once commanded fear across the galaxy cower before him. "Who are you?" the crime lord whispered, his voice trembling for the first time. The bartender tilted his head slightly, considering the question. "I'm the man you should have never crossed." The crime lord's face twisted with rage, but there was nothing he could do. His power, his influence, none of it mattered now. He had come to the cantina thinking he was untouchable, and now he was standing before a man who had orchestrated his downfall without him ever realizing it. "You won't get away with this," the crime lord hissed, his voice a mixture of anger and fear. "My people will find you. They'll hunt you down, and when they do—" "They won't," the bartender interrupted, his tone final. "Your people are already gone. And by the time anyone notices, there won't be anything left of your empire to come after me." The crime lord's face went pale. He had always believed himself invincible, but now, in the face of this quiet, unassuming man, he realized just how wrong he had been. The bartender took a step forward, and the crime lord flinched. "You're finished," the bartender said quietly. "And the only reason you're still breathing is because I want you to understand that. I want you to know that you've lost everything. And there's nothing you can do about it." The crime lord opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He was beaten, and he knew it. Without another word, he turned and fled the cantina, his footsteps echoing in the silence that followed. The bartender watched him go, then returned to his place behind the bar. He picked up the glass he had been cleaning, wiped it down one last time, and set it aside. The job was done. The Galactic crime lord's retreat was inevitable, but not the end. He left the cantina humiliated, his bravado stripped away, yet the bartender knew better than to think the man would stay quiet. It wasn't in his nature. Men like him always tried to claw their way back, desperate to hold on to the scraps of power they once wielded. For the bartender, this was the final phase. He didn't care for drawn-out speeches or dramatic exits. Everything he had done was designed to ensure that once the crime lord realized the depth of his defeat, there would be no chance for recovery. The old assassin had set things in motion long before their confrontation at the bar, and now, as the crime lord staggered through the streets, his empire was crumbling faster than he could comprehend. Back in the cantina, word had already spread. The regulars, the drifters and mercenaries who frequented the place, knew better than to ask questions. They went about their business, but with a new understanding. The quiet bartender they'd seen every day for years wasn't just an ordinary man. He had pulled off what no one else had dared to even attempt. He had toppled the untouchable. Out in the galaxy, the chaos unfolded exactly as planned. The bartender's contacts, the network he had cultivated in the shadows, moved swiftly. The crime lord's allies were turning on him, one by one. They had always been loyal out of fear, but now, with the man exposed as vulnerable, that fear was gone. His lieutenants saw opportunities to claim pieces of his empire for themselves. They wouldn't wait. They would seize power before anyone else could. It wasn't just the lieutenants either. Rivals from other factions, long kept in check by the crime lord's iron grip, were now emboldened. With the crime lord's resources cut off and his communications disrupted, they struck at his remaining strongholds. One by one, his assets fell. What had taken years to build was dismantled in days. The bartender had foreseen it all. This was how power worked in the criminal underworld. Once you lost control, everything else slipped away. It wasn't enough to defeat the crime lord personally. His reputation had to be shattered beyond repair. Now, every sector that had once feared his name would only remember the man who had been outplayed, outmaneuvered, and brought to ruin by someone he had dismissed as insignificant. As the days passed, the crime lord's desperation grew. He tried to regroup, to gather what forces he had left, but every attempt was met with failure. His soldiers deserted him, his trusted advisors abandoned him, and his finances were drained. Even the bounty hunters he once commanded refused to answer his calls. The galaxy had moved on, and it no longer had a place for him. And yet, even with everything collapsing around him, the crime lord couldn't accept his fate. He couldn't let go. His mind, clouded by rage and pride, clung to the belief that he could still turn things around, that there was some way to reclaim what he had lost. But every door was shut, every ally turned against him. The bartender had seen to that. Eventually, the crime lord did the only thing left for a man in his position: he tried to run. He gathered what little wealth he had left, made contact with an old smuggler, and arranged for transport out of the system. It was a pathetic plan, the last-ditch effort of someone who had no other options. But the bartender had known this would happen too. It was why he had left the crime lord alive in the first place. There was no need to kill him in the cantina. The galaxy would take care of that. The crime lord's escape never came. As he boarded the small ship, thinking he had found a way out, the smuggler betrayed him. A bounty had been placed on the crime lord's head, an astronomical sum, one that attracted the best hunters in the galaxy. The bartender hadn't set the bounty himself. He didn't need to. The crime lord's rivals had done it for him. When the bounty hunters arrived, it was swift and brutal. The crime lord had no time to resist, no chance to plead. He was taken down in a matter of seconds, his body left for dead on the cold steel of the landing pad. Just like that, the reign of the Galactic crime lord was over. Back in the cantina, life went on. The bartender cleaned the bar as usual, serving drinks to the regulars, who now looked at him with a newfound respect. They had seen the fall of a man who had terrorized the galaxy, and they knew who was behind it, even if no one spoke of it aloud. The bartender had no need for recognition. This was never about glory or revenge for the sake of revenge. It had always been about balance. About righting the wrong that had been done to his family, and ensuring that no one else would suffer the same fate at the hands of a man like the crime lord. With the job done, the bartender resumed his quiet life. He didn't need to chase after the next big target, or worry about what came next. His work here was finished. The galaxy would heal, as it always did, and he would remain in the background, watching, waiting, just as he always had. As the bartender cleaned the last glass for the night, he looked out over the empty cantina, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. The galaxy was a little quieter now, a little safer. And for him, that was enough.